Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming out on such a lovely day when the sun is shining. It's good to see so many of you. This is the third of our live family talks here in Falkirk. We've had some very interesting talks, and today we've got two very interesting and authoritative guests who are going to talk through that title of From Pandemic to Platforms, Raising Kids, Steady Kids in a Shifting World. So it should be a very interesting time. I'm going to do it as an interview with both Danny and George, but there's also the opportunity for you to ask questions. So please feel free in the last section to ask anything you like. If we don't know the answer, we'll tell you, but just feel free to ask whatever questions you have from our discussion. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. I'm Linda de Caestecker. I'm a public health doctor, and I've been honoured to be chairing these family talks, the last few of them. And I'm going to introduce you to George Hoskin, who I've worked with for many years, but particularly more recently. George, tell us about yourself.
Gosh, I spent most of my life, which has been very long, let me tell you, in international business. But about 30 years ago, my life completely changed. I came across some horrendous cases of child abuse where children were murdered by their parents. And when I read the stories of these children's lives before they were murdered, I came to the conclusion that being murdered was the best thing that ever happened to them. They had lived lives of unspeakable torture. And something snapped inside me, and a decision got made, and I've never felt that I made the decision. The decision made me. And the decision was, I can't live in a world where things like this happen to children, and I do nothing about it. And that has driven my life ever since. I gave up my career in business. I trained as a clinical criminologist. I was already a psychologist. I started working in prisons with violent men who had all the ones I worked with had suffered significant abuse in childhood. And I created a charity called Wave Trust, dedicated to preventing child abuse and neglect and domestic violence before they ever happen. So that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years. And for 20 of those, Linda's been a wonderful collaborator in work that we're doing.
Well, that's a very inspiring story. Thank you. Danny, you're on the front line. Tell us who you are and what you do.
I'm Danny Henderson. I've been working in residential childcare in various roles for 30 years, and I don't know how you follow that, George, to be honest. I don't know what to say, but I suppose I come at it from the kind of a different perspective in the sense that, the banality of the everyday and how that sort of impacts upon the experiences of children and young people living in residential childcare. And as a struggling parent, and I think parenting is a struggle.
I think all three of us would agree with that. Our children are growing up, but it's never an easy task. So we hear about the increasing problem of young people's poor mental health. In fact, it's been called, and you'll have heard this, a mental health crisis that's been getting worse since the pandemic. What's your impression of that? Do you agree with that? And what do you think the reasons are?
Well, certainly all the evidence that one sees, whether it's the behaviour of children in schools these days, which is quite frightening in some ways, or other symptoms, is that there is something of a mental health crisis. And the pandemic does seem to have been one of the triggers that has set that off. What unfortunately I think is that there are solutions to it, and I don't see the solutions being put in place. So that's one of the reasons in WAVE we focus very much on public policy and what changes in public policy could produce better outcomes. But let me not get into that right now. Danny?
I think there's a number of things going on. It's whether or not it's a crisis that's been built beneath the surface before is a question I would ask in relation to sort of how we pathologise problematic, issues, problematic, what we think of as problematic behaviours and things. Whether or not the relationship between the pandemic, I don't know, we had a really interesting experience working in residential childcare during the pandemic. For the the lockdowns actually kind of created this environment where young people were just functioning in the present. The kids that we were looking after felt like the pressure had been lifted off them in terms of education, even in terms of some contact with their communities. And it was completely at odds with what we expected to happen. And there was something about that kind of, the containing experience of children and young people that unravelled quite quickly after the containing sort of policies, if you like, of the pandemic lifted. But some real learning in that for us about how you kind of create nurture spaces that are contained and kind of removing some of the pressures that are on young people. So what I would say, if there's a mental health crisis, it's probably due to the multiple pressures that's imposed on them by society and by sort of technology and the things that they're exposed to now that maybe wasn't a feature of the past.
Yeah. And certainly in previous family talks, if you've listened to any of them, particularly the online ones, we've talked about some of the risks in that digital age and sextortion, the manosphere, etc., and how that is affecting young people's mental health. Would you agree that the digital age is actually quite a pressure, although there's huge advantages in it, is quite a pressure for our young people?
It's a tremendous pressure. And it's addictive. And I think anybody who's had a child with a phone in their hand, trying to get it off them or persuade them to put it down and do something different will know that it can be very, very challenging. I remember once that Anthula and I were working with some very difficult teenagers, and one of the girls we were working with would bring about 3 mobile phones into the room with her. And if you tried to get her to put one down, she would just produce another one. She could not live without her active mobile phone. So there has to be very clear boundaries when you're working with children about when they can have the mobile phone or other digital contact. Because if we don't set boundaries, it begins to dominate their lives. And unfortunately, for the most part, it dominates it in a negative way. Recent evaluations in Scotland of the levels of happiness and attitudes to enjoying life in children show that it has deteriorated significantly in the last 10 years. And I think this digital pressure is the major reason for that.
And yet in other countries, they are not seeing that same happiness reducing in young people. Is there anything to learn from that?
Well, I guess it depends which countries you're comparing with, and I only know of some, but certainly in some countries there is a lot more emphasis on getting the right attitudes and support to children in the very earliest years. And as you will know, Linda, in WAVE, we emphasize the incredible importance of the first 3 years of a child's life. During that period, just think of this next time you look at a baby. A baby's brain adds new connections at more than 1 million per second. Actually, 1.7 million per second for the first 3 years of its life. That means the brain is incredibly malleable during that period, but it also means it's incredibly vulnerable during that period. If we get it right during that period, if we ensure, for example, that children develop secure attachment by the right quality of parenting during that period, we actually provide a buffer against the later problems that come along. And children with secure attachment are much less likely, there's been research studies, they're much less likely to become addicted to problematic internet use or problematic mobile phone use. If children develop insecure attachment, which is about 35 to 40% of the population in Scotland, then they're at much higher risk of that and many other problems as well. And that is determined to a large extent actually in the first 2 years of a child's life, dependent on the quality of care it receives during that period. So there are many, this is a complex topic. Forgive me if I seem to oversimplify it, but there's no question. The absolute critical element is what experience the children have in those very earliest years. That does not mean you cannot cure it later. And those of you who are foster parents, Don't give up. Even if a child's had a terrible early experience, you can put it right later if you do the right things. But you are fighting an uphill battle some of the time, and I'm sure you experience that.
Just to stay in that topic, I remember reading that first, I don't know if it was the first, but that WAVE report on preventing violence by work in the early years. And it had a huge impact on me as a public health doctor in terms of the need to focus on early years. And I remember it was about early attachment, but also attunement, which wasn't at the time something that really we thought a lot about. Explain that to us as well.
So, whether a child becomes securely attached or not securely attached to the father and mother, or the primary caregiver, if it's not the father or mother, is to a large extent determined by the time it's 18 months of age. And that creates like a template for a child's future relationships throughout life. For example, there's one study which actually suggested that all domestic violence perpetrators have insecure attachment. That may not be all, but there's no question it's a very large percentage. In other words, if we could stop children having insecure attachment, then we would massively reduce domestic violence in our society. But we've looked at the pathway before secure attachment or insecure attachment to see what makes the biggest difference. And that's where the point you've made comes in, Linda. In the early stages of a baby's life, I mean, I've got 3 children and 7 grandchildren. I didn't think children began to be like really interactive and thinking till they were about 12 months of age. I was totally wrong. From the moment they're born, children are interacting actively with their carer. And if the carer understands that and interacts in a way that is sensitive to the emotional and physical cues being given off by the baby, what we call attunement, or some people call sensitive parenting, you create a harmonious interaction with the child that supports the development of secure attachment. If, as a general practice, parents are ignoring the signals of the child, or they try to control the child's behavior in a way that is not harmonious with the signals the child is giving off, then the child is more likely to develop insecure attachment. And the crazy thing about this is we could teach every child in school how to develop good attunement and create children with secure attachment. We could teach that, and everyone would know how to do it. But instead, we teach algebra or French or any subject under the sun, but we don't teach the most important thing of all, which is how to be a parent.
Just to go back to young people and mental health, we heard in some of the previous family talks, parents and carers saying it's very hard to get access to CAMHS, very hard to get an assessment or then treatment. So what can parents or carers do in the meantime? I'll start with you, Danny, but I know you said to me something very interesting, and whether you want to explore this, you'd said, well, CAMHS isn't the silver bullet. And just talk us through what you were thinking when you said that.
I just think sometimes we look for the kind of solution with ourselves, and actually it sort of ties in with what George has described in terms of attachment theory. And, you know, we have it within ourselves to be able to sort of support some level of recovery in the day-to-day. That attunement, I suppose, always kind of conscious and you know, my early time as a residential worker, when, you know, you had this sort of sense that you should be in control of everything, and you should be, and how that impacted upon your relationships with kids, because they, much as, you know, we need to be attuned to them, they're attuned to us as well, and actually what we feel is often mirrored in their kind of, you know, in their emotion. So if we're anxious, they're anxious, and I think that's kind of, you know, so I suppose having an environment, you know, whereby the role of carers is actually sort of given some status and is given some protection, some support, I think is important. And quite often, you know, we medicalise kids and problematise these issues, but they're much more organic, and they're not something that can necessarily be, you know, fixed. It's not a question of fixing children, or young people. It's a question of sort of nurturing them, and sort of creating those neural pathways as opposed to start to support them to develop different ways of experiencing themselves within the world, because those attachment relationships reflect, if they don't exist, or they're ambivalent or anxious or insecure, then that they feel insecure in the world. That secure base doesn't exist. So I don't know. My own experience is that sometimes we look for the intervention, the one intervention that will make things better because we're struggling. But actually, I think for parents, for carers, for residential workers, foster carers, it's finding a way to struggle well. Because I think it's always going to be a struggle when you're trying to sort of attune to a child who's possibly not had those kind of positive early year experiences.
What would you say about that, George? As Danny says, foster carers are looking after a young person who hasn't had that positive experience. They're worried about their mental health. What are things they could do to help?
Let me tell you a story. True story. A few years ago, we carried out a study of people who had severe and multiple disadvantage in their lives. So more than one of things like mental health problems, addiction, antisocial behavior, all kinds of things like that. And as part of that study, which by the way is written up in a report on WAVE's website called Age 2 to 18, Systems to Protect Children from Severe Disadvantage. And Thula, at the back there, my wife, interviewed 50 people who had serious and multiple disadvantage. And almost all of them were people who were homeless and were living on the street with problems of addiction and mental health and so on. And she asked them lots of questions. And let me tell you, having read the answers, the lives that these people had and the start to life they had was horrendous. But there's one question she asked all of them and got almost the identical answer from every person. She said, what one thing would have made the biggest difference to your life? And do you know what the answer was? Someone who believed in me. Someone who believed in me. Now, the horrifying thing about that is, by definition, those 50 people, not one of them had experienced someone who believed in them in their lives. But we know from our work in WAVE that even just one person makes a huge difference. I've asked hundreds of people at presentations we've made, is there one person in your life who really made a difference? And I've heard the answers over and over again. And people will say, I was struggling at school, and then suddenly there was this one teacher. And when I say to them, what difference did that teacher make? Again and again, what they'll say, she believed in me. She was the one person who made me believe in myself. So the single greatest thing that I think any one of you can do, and this applies just as much if you're not a foster carer, but a parent or a grandparent, is be a person that believes in that child and supports them in believing in themselves. And to do that, you have to focus on their strengths. You have to recognize their strengths. So number one, look for their strengths. Number two, interact with them in a way that gives them a belief for themselves that that strength can be powerful in the world. Some of the people who've been horrendously abused in life have gone on to have incredibly successful lives. Many of the men I've worked with in prison are actually incredibly intelligent, capable people, only they've used it in pursuit of criminality rather than positive things. So these children, they're often at a tipping point where their lives can go one way or the other, and you can be the person that turns them on a positive pathway. And there's other things that I could add, but just to stick to the key thing at the moment, give them a belief in themselves by making it clear that you believe in them.
Is that your experience also, Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly, like, that's great. I think it's really difficult to reach that position sometimes when young people's behaviours are such that they're designed to push everybody away and protect themselves. And I think that's why you need that sort of wraparound support really for for the work we do, and that understanding, because certainly when I first started working in residential childcare, there was not that perspective. There was this idea that we needed to be maintaining discipline and order. And I think some of the issues that that we struggle with is sort of allowing disorder to occur in order to be able to sort of get in and work with people within a disordered environment and reorder, because that's part of the recovery, that's part of the healing. To become reactive to disorder is, and as parents, as foster carers, as residential workers, I think we have that tendency to be reactive when and we get anxious around disorder, but actually it's necessary. It's a necessary part of growth. And I think it's amplified if young people have experienced trauma or they have attachment difficulties. So it's all the more kind of profound and affecting for us as adults. But I think the kind of priority, or what we should be trying to focus on, is maintaining that that stability, that some level of kind of calm in order to be able to sort of make sense and respond rather than react.
If I just come in, Danny's making some really brilliant points here. Thank you, Danny. He said earlier that your mood can actually change the child's mood, your thoughts and the way you're being, because the child is attuning to you at the same time as you hopefully are attuning to the child. If you're anxious, it will become anxious. If you are sad, it may well become sad. It's well known that sad parents tend to create sad children, not just temporarily, but actually throughout their lives. So the most critical thing, along with what I'm saying, believing in them, which I'm sorry to repeat what Danny's just said, but I really want to reinforce the excellent point he's made, is generating calmness in your relationship with the children. Any child can be incredibly challenging, especially when they're 2 years old. But if you can stay calm, no matter what's going on, even if they're shouting at you, swearing at you, attempting to be violent, whatever, if you get triggered into reacting, things just escalate and go wrong from there. So being calm and staying calm, if that means leaving the room or whatever, do that. And then getting the child to also become calm. One technique you can use is get them to breathe slowly, or do this yourself if you need to become calm. There's a technique called smell the flower, which is like breathing in through the nose for 4 or 5 seconds, sort of, and then blow out the candle through your mouth. So both practicing it yourself and teaching the child in the moment of dysregulation to do that so that both of you become calm enables you to deal with the situation in a way which is not reactive. Because if you become reactive, you lose control. So, sorry, I just wanted to support what Danny was saying there.
Really helpful. And as an aside, in our wellbeing events, we have a whole breath works class, which I joined last week, I think. And it was so helpful, that training yourself to breathe as part of that calming yourself. You mentioned, Danny, the word trauma, and we hear a lot about trauma in early years these days, and how it can affect lifelong somebody's well-being and health, physical health, cardiovascular disease. It could predict your life expectancy, how much trauma you've had as children. So, and it also can affect your risk of addictions, etc. What do we mean by trauma in that kind of, in that environment? And is it always the case that it causes problems?
I don't always know what we mean by trauma in terms of the definition, because trauma has become a byword for a number of other kind of, we could talk about what, disorganized attachment. It's still, everything seems to have been kind of taken over by trauma, but trauma that's like, trauma's a sort of series that changes the way you kind of view the world. It can be traumatic events. People can be exposed to trauma without being traumatized to some extent, but what we're talking about is systemic trauma, where there's repeated adversities, repeated sort of emotional injuries, you know, and to the point where it kind of defines their worldview. I think that's what we're talking about in terms of early years trauma and developmental injuries.
And sometimes that can lead to behaviours for carers that are difficult and confusing. How do you know? Or you're just being naughty and defiant, or is this a trauma response? Does it matter knowing the difference? Should you approach that?
I think it's very important that carers, parents, all of us understand that a lot of what we might call challenging behavior or bad, or it certainly used to be called bad behavior, is actually a reaction to the past experience of trauma. If you imagine that right now somebody told you that there was somebody out in that corridor with a gun and you have to do something very rapidly, your heart rate would shoot up. You'd start thinking to yourself, can I hide under the table there? Can I get out by a different exit? You know, what can I do in this situation? Everything would become highly elevated. And then if somebody said, I'm sorry, I was only joking, apart from the fact that you want to go and do injury to them, you know, you'd come back down to normal again. Children with trauma have that elevated level of stress all the time. Imagine having that elevated level of tension every single second of life. And what that means is they're constantly on edge. They're constantly looking for danger. They're constantly expecting something bad to happen. Whether that's somebody hitting them, if that's been their past experience, somebody putting them down, if that's been their past experience, or just somebody being completely untrustworthy and unreliable, if that's been their past experience. And when you're living on the edge like that all the time, you can very quickly get triggered by events to react. A lot of aggression in children is actually masking fear. Many different kinds of fear. I won't go into that, it'd take too long. But if you start asking yourself, not why is this child such a bad child, but what is happening inside that child? What happened in that child's life to create this reaction in them? And exploring that gently as you get to know the child, you start to see different things. Again, if you forgive me, I'll just tell you a story that in my own life, one day, I came home from work to find my youngest daughter, Isla, her name is, pulling her favorite doll to pieces. Now, I was brought up in an age where I was smacked by my father whenever I was naughty. He was a very loving father, but he believed in discipline, and in those days, smacking was normal, as getting the belt at school was in my day. Sorry, I'm sure none of you ever got the belt at school, but I did. So I initially smacked my children, I'm sorry to say. So I looked at Isla pulling her doll apart, but I was studying psychology at the time. So I was actually more interested to know why she was pulling her favorite doll to pieces than thinking of punishing her. So I said to her, Isla, why are you pulling your favorite doll to pieces? And she started to cry because she thought I was going to punish her. And I said, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to touch you. I just want to understand. She took a little while to calm down, and through sobs, she said to me, because Iona hit me. Iona was her big sister. Sorry, I named my children after islands because I was born on the island of Isla. So I went to Iona, and I said to Iona, Iona wasn't allowed to hit Isla. I said, did you hit Isla today? And Iona began to cry because she also thought she was going to get punished. And I said to her, Iona, calm down. I'm not going to punish you. I just want to understand. Just tell me. And through sobs, she said to me, because Neil hit me. Neil's my eldest. And then I remembered that before I went to work that day, Neil had done something that I thought was very naughty, and I smacked him. And I remembered, because I was working in industry at the time, if a boss of a department came in a bad mood in the morning, by lunchtime, that bad mood had traveled all the way down through the organization to junior staff. So my action I had thought, you punish a child and it's over and done with, they've learned a valuable lesson, job done. I was utterly wrong. My behavior affected Neil. He then passed it on to Iona. She passed it on to Isla. Thank goodness we didn't have any pets at the time. So the doll ultimately suffered. And I learned that day what an impact our behavior can have, passing it down the line on others. And I never, ever smacked a child again. And I'm deeply ashamed that I ever did that. Sorry, I just wanted to share that story with you as an example of how an event, you losing your temper, one of us losing our temper in a situation with a child can have major impacts. But if a child has suffered that kind of impact, not once, but over and over again, it develops an expectation and a reaction. And once you understand that, you can have compassion even for their bad behavior. You just have to sit, support them, love them, but always set clear boundaries about what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Sorry, that was a bit of
No,
an answer.
it's a very, very good example, isn't it? And we won't always get it right, but to be able to connect with your children and understand your behavior influences them. As you say, we see it in the workplace, but we see it in families too. Well, how do you? Yeah, Danny, you want to?
There was just, you asked the question: would you respond differently to something if you knew it was born of trauma? And I think we've done a lot of work within our sector around sort of trauma-informed care, and there was sessions on disassociation and sessions on like trauma triggers and went back to work and thought that was right. That's trauma. We'll deal with that as trauma because that we can and actually behaviour you just don't know because it's inherent in sort of the experience, that hypersensitivity and kind of and I don't know what you would do. Never like so we would be having these debates about whether or not that was trauma or whether or not it was just instrumental aggression or things like that. And I don't know that there's any point in trying to differentiate between what might be trauma or what might just be some sort of behaviour that requires connection through that relationship. And, I think we've got three main tasks, if you like, in terms of supporting children to kind of develop the struggle for belonging, the struggle for identity, and the struggle for meaning. And that is only really possible through dialogue. And it's not necessarily like a symmetrical dialogue. As an adult, you kind of have a key role in that in terms of leading that. But anything that's not dialogical doesn't actually sort of bring about sustainable change. And the more dialogue that we can have in relation to some of the issues that we might struggle with, and the more likely that's the kind of I suppose within that day-to-day is what we need to do. So I worry sometimes that trauma theory is kind of given us permission to sort of fawn, just to accept, that some behavioural outbursts are just accepted and then we move on. I think we do have a responsibility to kind of, try and support that young person to find better ways of coping. But that's not the same, that's not, punishment doesn't really work. We know that. Some of us certainly brought up thinking that, as a residential worker, a novice residential worker, that all I had was what my parents had given me, and I was punished quite regularly. So But no, but I did. There was some level of physical.
I'm glad I wasn't the only bad one, Danny.
You know, but you know, you learn that actually this is probably not working, and I need better ways of dealing with this kind of stuff. You know, but it's you have to be aware that your internal parent has been created by your parenting experience, and sort of the things that make you angry are probably not really worth getting angry about at all. But you know, that thing, isn't it, when you realise one day as a parent or as a carer that I sound like my dad. You know, you have to check yourself, you know, so there's something about the trauma discussion that maybe, I think it's important that we have the knowledge. I think it's important to acknowledge that trauma's, you know, there, and that young people that have had early years adversity, neglect and abuse will have experienced some level of trauma. But I think the sensitivity that supports children's growth and development and sense of belonging is not necessarily reserved for kids that have experienced trauma.
Sure. And you mentioned triggers. What did you mean by that?
Well, again, it's a bit of a buzzword in relation to trauma theory, but it can be anything. That might, you know, it could be a sense. You know, it could be. I remember we've had to sort of, in the one situation, we had to move a worker that was working with a young person because the guy had a beard and he reminded her of a traumatic experience. Other situations where there might be a sensory cue through aftershave that may kind of sort of trigger a traumatic experience. It could be a loud noise. It could be, you know, it could be just, again, we've had workers that resemble adult figures from children's past that somehow, you know, that relationship can never work because there's just such a strong resonance with their memories of having experienced these traumatic incidents. So it could be a multitude of different things depending on the individual experience.
George, can I go back to where you started and the work that you're doing about prevention of abuse and neglect and the commission that you've set up? And what you said at the start was there are solutions to these issues that we're seeing for children and young people. We're dying to know, what does all that research tell us, if you can summarise it, about what are the solutions that we need to put in place?
One of the key things we found in the 3 years that Linda and I have been working together with Sir Harry Burns and others, and during this we've drawn research from 30 of the world's leading experts on prevention, and we've now received over 400 documents of evidence. What we learned is that there are 4 key skills that when children develop, their lives tend to turn out very well. And if they lack these skills, then they're on a pathway to much less successful lives. And the key skills are executive function, by which basically I mean the ability to look at alternative decisions in life and make a rational and sensible choice between those alternatives. Self-control, so being able, for example, to delay gratification in order to, you know, have a better outcome later rather than just doing what is immediately beneficial in the instant. Emotional self-regulation, i.e. not losing control of yourself. That's a very, very important one for parents, by the way. A lot of what happens in child abuse happens because the parent doesn't have emotional self-regulation in that moment. A lot of what goes wrong, I mean. And finally, sense of agency, by which I mean a belief that you actually can influence future outcomes in your life. But the interesting thing is, we looked at what proceeded in the pathway of children, of developing, say, by age 2, 3, 4, these 4 key skills. And the key thing is secure attachment. If children have secure attachment, I explained that earlier, then they're much more likely to develop these 4 key skills. And if they develop insecure attachment, which is about 35 to 40% of Scotland's population, then it's that, by the way, you can have a very successful life with insecure attachment. I'm told one man became president of the United States with insecure attachment. But you tend to have very poor relationship skills, or you tend to be more at risk of negative things happening. But nonetheless, it's not a life sentence. It just is a higher risk factor. So if we can ensure secure attachment in children, we set them on the best possible pathway. And how do you develop secure attachment? Through very good sensitivity and attunement in the first year or 15, 18 months of life. And actually, just recently, there's been some very interesting research which says, by Bruce Perry, if you've heard of Bruce Perry working with Oprah Winfrey, which says that actually the first 2 months of life are utterly critical. And I've seen research studies that show that by age 3 months, there's a clear distinction between children who are on positive pathways and children who are on risk pathways at 2 months. And the divergence between 2 months and 11 years of age simply gets wider and wider from that point onwards. So to answer your question, Linda, I think we should support every parent in the early couple of years of a child's life, including pregnancy, and we should train our school children to understand these fundamental facts so nobody leaves school. It almost doesn't matter whether they can count or not, but it does matter whether they can parent or not. So we can change all of this if we put the right policies in place. There are other aspects too. There's a whole another stream about play and the importance of play in education, which we get wrong in Scotland. But I won't go down that pathway for the moment. But these are some of the key things that have come out in our 3 years of study. And later this year, we'll be publishing our report. The project, which started off called 70-30, which reflected a campaign to reduce child abuse, neglect and domestic violence by 70% by the year 2030, the commissioners renamed the project Transforming Scotland in a Generation. And they renamed it because we truly believe that if government and policymakers follow the discoveries that we've made in these 3 years, Scotland can be transformed in the next generation of children, and that means forever afterwards. Because the intergenerational pattern, which has poor forms of parenting or disadvantage, get passed inadvertently from generation to generation, would be broken. And instead, we'd be transmitting positives from generation to generation. What a prize that would be.
And you and Athula have done a huge amount of work on that. So we'll look forward to that report, which you'll be able to see at some point, quite soon, we hope. Danny, when we've talked a lot about the importance of early years of a child's past, should we as carers, parents, try and talk to a child about their past if it's been very traumatic and difficult, or should we try and avoid talking about it?
I think that depends on the anybody's capacity to go there and actually to what extent did they have a tangible memory of the past. Some of the experiences I've had, particularly the very early experiences, won't be something that they can necessarily kind of speak to, or it's imprinted in the psyche, but not stored as a somatic memory in the body, rather than as something that's tangible. For other young people, I think you let them. I don't know why I'm saying this. I've no theoretical basis, but my intuition would be that you allow them to kind of to when they start to explore these things. I think supporting young people to develop a narrative and of their story, where they've come from, is a really healthy thing to do in terms of trying to come to terms with who they are and find, develop a sense of identity. But it really does depend and of an intuition that we sometimes are too kind of interested in talking sort of therapies, if you like, actually. With children, I think it's probably better to do the recovering sort of stuff with them, like the nurture, the compensatory care. you're trying to figure out where a young person is in their developmental journey, and if there are gaps in that developmental journey, how you fill those in through nurture and routine and rituals, rather than sort of speak to them about what's missing. Or, so, and I think the other aspect to that is that, there are other things at play here as well, and one of my concerns about the sort of the trauma narrative is that it doesn't attend to the kind of the injustice narrative, if you like, the structural injustices that lots of young children, young people are exposed to through poverty, through kind of deprivation, and through other social issues that we could sort of do something about too. Most parents do want to be good parents and don't set out to be bad parents. Abuse is obviously something that's pernicious and malicious, but that's not the whole story of what we're talking about in relation to young people that need looked after away from home at all. The parenting capacity, it just isn't always just quite right, for a lot of people that become parents. And so I would agree with George in the sense that, even as a parent, as a residential worker, if I'd done some of that stuff at school, it would probably have stopped me from making a lot of mistakes when I was, starting off, and a better understanding of what it means to look after a child. Because, as I said earlier, all you've got is what you've been given, unless there's something tangible, and you're kind of, in terms of theory and in terms of the why. There's lots of things we know now that we didn't know previously. And didn't know when my mum and dad were bringing me up, so that's, it's kind of important that we do think about how we support parenting capacity, both in terms of, the kind of structural issues that people might be exposed to, and the kind of, the looking after young children is really, really difficult, and it can be overwhelming at times, and you need support. And I did, I did, and most people do.
What advice would we give? Well, you must do it with your residential care colleagues, but what advice to give to carers and foster carers, parents themselves, on how they can take care of themselves? Because if we're stressed and finding it difficult, we talked about breathing, but that's in the crisis situation. In general, what advice would we give? George, do you want to start?
Well, you can't pour from an empty cup. So it's very important that you take care of yourself. So there will be certain things that you can do in life that that are good for you, and it differs. For me, it's going and watching a good football match does me the power of good. Listening to beautiful classical music is something else that I really like. But each person will have something different. So somehow, I would say, make sure you do build into your life something that is for you, that looks after you. But also, and by the way, we've got a handout with us and Fulla will hand out at the end, that's actually got a series of useful points for any carer or foster parent to be aware of. And it does deal with this. Have someone that you can talk to in moments of stress. Someone that if you pick up the phone and said to them, I've just had the day from hell and I don't know what to do, that they're going to listen and support you in that situation. And also know how to regulate yourself. Because, it's one of the toughest jobs on earth, bringing up a child who's had trauma. They can be absolutely a nightmare, or they can be completely, I've worked with children who they just won't talk to you. You ask them a question and you're lucky if you get a grunt. And then it's like, how do you find out anything if they're not prepared to communicate with you? But you've got to get that they're scared. They don't trust anybody. So you need a lot of patience. But take care of yourself. Find things that you can do that regulate you. And have a friend or someone you can talk to, a colleague, whatever, another parent in the same circumstances that you can pick up the phone to or have a cup of coffee with, that just sets you back down to base zero again. And congratulate yourself, because you're probably doing a very good job even though you think you're not. Because if you're giving that child belief in itself, then you're doing something that is absolutely priceless.
I'm going to stop for a minute, or, well, longer than a minute, but I want to see if you've got questions. And I know it's very hot in here, so hopefully it can all last a bit longer. I've got other questions, but it'd be really good to hear from any of you if you've got questions. And great, someone at the front, and we've got a microphone.
Recording. If anyone doesn't want to be in the recording, please just let me know. We can edit you out, no problem.
Okay. Do you want to say who you are?
Yeah, my name's Els Walker, and I'm one of the panel chairs, like Care Vision. So I sit on the foster carer reviews. I've been in social work, or was until I retired, for decades, and it frustrates me, and is still frustrating me, that we talk about, you know, just what you said at the end there, George, we have to look after ourselves and learn to make all of that. And there's part of me, yeah, that's true. And as foster carers, that's important. But it's the peer thing before that, because I've worked with many, many, many women who don't have the time or the inclination. They're living in a society where we have to start looking at the political as well as the personal. We have got, you know, we understand that trauma-informed practice works, and we understand that there's a lot of violent men out there who have been abused themselves. But in my view, it's frustrating, because I have listened and learned over the years and nothing has changed. Nothing. And that's the bit that politically we have to look at it. We still live in a patriarchal society. And I'd echo what you say about parenting in school, because to me that's one of the fundamental things that we get wrong in this country, is just that we don't teach children. And I know that if we're going, you know, so that in the years, next generation will get it right, we have to look at the kids that are living just now. You know, they are going to be the next generation, and that is politically, but the education gap, the education attainment gap has widened. So we've got kids who are still not getting the support they need. We've got kids who have got additional needs. All the services are cut, so we can, all the psychologists and everybody can say this, what this child needs. But politically, there's nothing out there to provide this. So how do we then work with these children with no services? How does that happen? And how do we support women and men so that foster carers aren't needed as much because they're with their family and they're staying at home? It's fine looking after the carers who are looking after them now, but society's failing the parents who give birth to these children. And so how do we tackle that? How do we join the personal and the political? And all the research that's been done over the years, and I've heard and read much, much research. How do we change it so that it does change, rather than it just being hypothetical or wishful? Sorry,
No, that's a great question that's in all of our minds, and I hope you have an answer.
something.
Well,
It was a bit.
there's two parts to it. There's the what to do. The what to do, in my view, is not difficult. We know what to do. I'm not sure what Linda would think, but I knew 25 years ago what to do nearly as well as I know it now. I read presentations I wrote 25 years ago, and I'll read them, and the only difference between then and now isn't that any of what I knew then has changed, but the evidence and support of what I knew has grown massively in the meantime.
Which is sad.
So why don't we do it is the key question. And the answer to that is also relatively simple. Again, forgive me if I tell you a story. I once, when Theresa May was Prime Minister, wanted to arrange a meeting with her to present to her the solutions which I believed would make a difference. And I had a meeting with her MP private support advisor his name also was George. And I was asking him if I could have a meeting with Theresa May to put these solutions to him. And he said to me, George, you will never succeed. Do you know why? And I could guess what he was going to say, but I said to him, tell me why, George. He said, it's simple. We MPs are elected every 5 years. That means we need to be able to go back to the electorate in 3 to 4 years and tell them what a good job we've done in the intervening period. So we will focus on things that make a difference within 3 to 4 years. Your ideas will take 10 years or more to make a huge difference. So we're not going to do it. And I said, but George, what about HS2? What about Trident? They have long-term outcomes. And you're investing in things like that. They were at the time. And he said, well, yes, George, but it has to be the received wisdom in Westminster. Same we apply for Holyrood. It has to be the received wisdom that changing parenting in the early year or two is what really matters in society. It's just not the received wisdom. So that's what has to change, because otherwise politicians will go ahead focusing on the short term and not changing the long term.
So how do we do that?
Well, here is what we're going to try to do, but I don't know if it will work or not. We're going to produce our report. Our report, it may be November before it finally comes out, because we want to share the drafts with a number of people and get feedback before we finalise it. It's going to lay out a blueprint to transform Scotland in a generation. Now, there's two things will happen. Our goal is that we will get the leaders of every political party in Scotland to say, we will work together to implement that blueprint. That's what I hope will happen. The other possibility is every one of them will look at it and say, there's a general election coming up in 2026. How can I use this report to attack the other political parties and show why people should vote for us? And then they all attack each other and they don't agree to work collaboratively on it. Now, you can guess whether it's going to be A or B. All I will say is Linda and Harry Burns and I will be doing our very best to get outcome A in that situation. And there are promising factors. I mentioned 70-30 earlier, the WAVE campaign to create a 70% reduction in child abuse, neglect, and domestic violence by 2030. 3 years ago, when we set up the commission, every leader of every political party in Holyrood had signed up to support 70-30. And out of 129 MSPs, 128 had expressed their support for 70-30. And that's why we're doing it in Scotland, by the way. We could have been doing this in Wales or England or elsewhere. It's why we chose Scotland. Because there is that understanding and acceptance of the importance of the early years. So if we can use that common support across all the political parties, it was even in the manifesto of the Liberal Democrats in 2010 to support 70-30. It was in the manifesto of the Labour Party in Scotland in the last Scottish general election to support 70-30. The Welsh Conservatives have expressed their support for it. So this is something the government, the Scotland government, declared their support for it in 2022. So they've all declared their support for it at some point or other. If we can get them to act consistently with what they've said in the past, we can succeed. And that's what we got to aim for.
Danny, any thoughts on maybe what we could do more as individuals, but even is there more Care Visions could do to push all that up the agenda?
I think it is political choices, and it's, I would have spent a bit of time in Scandinavia a few years ago in children's services in Scandinavia, and the quality of institutions at their very early years, from birth and pre-birth right through you know, the quality of universal services, early years education, you know, there are sort of clearly things that we could do even in terms of sort of how we kind of realign or transform the function of educational institutions, because they're fundamentally kind of designed to support the economy, and I don't know that they do that anymore either, because the fact is that we were sort of expecting people to come through the education system to go into no longer in such abundance. So there's something about play-based sort of, you know, education systems, sort of, you know, community-based services, valuing carers, you know, valuing and the role of women that does speak to political choices. And they do have consensus, and it was Denmark that they do have political consensus. There is a welfare consensus that sort of, you know, the across the political parties there, that you know, they're similar sized country to us, you know, and similar sized economy. So it's possible, but political choices, you know, who we vote for is important, but maybe there isn't that kind of, you know,
Which choice?
you know, maybe we're not quite sure what is voting for. But I think there's something fundamentally sort of, you know, I don't know that things are necessarily getting worse. I think we know more about what's happening now, and I think, you know, the data probably doesn't support that things are necessarily getting worse, but they're not getting better quickly, you know, when we have the solutions, when the solutions exist.
Yeah, that's the situation.
You know, and there are early years interventions that we could sort of use that, you know, the Why Not Trust doing stuff with care experienced parents, for example. But these smaller projects need to become universal and part of that wider sort of universal system that everybody gets, because quite often we know what's been reported and what's been detected. There's lots of things that we don't know about until, you know, until young men are in prison or whatever. So, you know, there is something about kind of our reaches. It's very much a triage system where there has to be an emergency or an urgent issue to attend to, or a concern raised before we actually start to worry about individual children's. Yeah.
Scotland is potentially leading in this respect. There are really positive signs. We have the promise. The promise is a commitment to transform the lives of looked after children. The only problem is the promise hasn't got any funding clearly attached to it to deliver what the promise has said we need to do. In our project, the Transforming Scotland in a Generation project, one of the issues we solve is where to find the funding. We've recently had, in June, the Scottish Government produced a number of really critical strategy documents. One was the Public Service Reform Strategy, and another one was the Population Health Framework. They mandated that NHS and local authorities must move money into prevention, especially primary prevention, i.e. preventing harm before it happens in the first place. That is brilliant. That has created a policy framework into which the things we need to do can be fitted. Again, something is missing. I don't blame the government for this. It's just a step that's yet to be taken, because they don't say where the money will come from to make the shift. But again, in the Transforming Scotland in a Generation project, we have a solution to do that. Also, the Population Health Framework, for example, doesn't say how a local authority or NHS can switch money from reaction to prevention. But again, we do have solutions in the Transforming Scotland project. So if you marry what the government is committed to with what we have built up over 3 years of intensive work and put them together, you have a blueprint which can transform Scotland. So if you're asking what any of you here can do in support of that, write to your MSP and tell your MSP that you absolutely desire that they support the solutions which are going to be offered with the blueprint for Transforming Scotland in a Generation, because that will put effective primary prevention in place and it will transform the lives of the next generation. The character of a society is determined by the character of the children of the future. If we can change the character of the future children of Scotland, we can transform Scotland from a country with some of the worst statistics in Western Europe in areas like drug deaths or addiction or many other measures. We can become one of the best. That's what's available as a prize if we do the right things. It won't be easy, but it is possible.
So we've gone from the individual to the political, but questions on any of that spectrum, yes.
Pat Priest, I'm also a chair with Care Visions and Fostering Paddle. That there were two questions I had. I think, the one, you shocked me right at the beginning by saying that the children that had been so badly abused, you thought at the time would probably be better off dead. So I've been working hard to get over that right from the word go. And I just wondered whether with your training and a retrospective view, whether that view has changed?
Only if those children were taken out of the care of their parents who murdered them. What I'm saying is, given that they were in the control of those parents, I mean, heaven knows how they didn't get picked up, but we hear so many cases that things don't get picked up. But the lives that they lived, they were being tortured daily. I wouldn't want anyone to suffer that in life.
Like most children, you just wanted the abuse to stop. You didn't want them dead.
Well, of course not.
Okay. I just needed to get the stages for myself. The other thing that you've been talking about is educating people, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think, though, again, my view is that it should be much more generic. We shouldn't be talking about teaching people how to parent. We should be teaching people that they have a choice to parent or not. Because in my experience, a lot of the people I've had to work with didn't necessarily want to be parents. They ended up being parents by default. And sometimes they ended up being parents because that was the best political choice for them to actually survive life. So again, I think it's about teaching people how to be human. And within that, teaching both male and females that they have a choice whether to be parents or not. And therefore, it could be a positive experience for people. Because if they're making positive choice, then hopefully they will invest emotionally in that option.
Good point.
Yeah, and there are a lot of initiatives working with young women in particular to talk about that. But yeah, they're not at scale, and we don't do enough of it. One of my saddest occasions was when I was still a clinical doctor, and a young woman came in, 14, and she wasn't using any contraception, but she was sexually active. And the doctor who was with me said to her, why are you doing that? Don't you think you're at risk? Why are you not using contraception? And she just said, nothing good ever happens to me. So that was the good thing that could have happened, was could she have got pregnant? So it was just, so we needed to help her with her self-esteem and care for her as an individual. Any other last questions before we finish?
Lady on the right here, Helen.
Hi there, my name's Ailey McDonald and I work for Care Visions and the recruitment team. I've been a social worker for about 20 years and I worked in Drumchapel, and it was the rollout of the community schools back very long time ago now. And it was a fantastic resource and I loved being in that team. And we had health and we had social work and we had education, and we also had, some of you have seen Glasgow Girls, based on the girls that they were in the school. So it was a really fantastic time. But we got given 2 years to change the attendance and attainment of Drumchapel, which is one of the most deprived areas in Glasgow, and was starting to do really good things. And sadly, that ended. And just go back to the point about preventative stuff, and in the area, what I loved about Drumchapel was that the people, grassroots, people helped people. There was things like family resource units. There was the community team for the teenagers. It wasn't a utopia, but there was definitely great things going on in the community, with the community, working hand in hand. But sadly, so much of that got pulled. But that's the sort of stuff in the communities trying to change things. So we were trying to work with the attainment and attendance and just even getting them into school. You know, I was something like the child catcher behind my car, trying to take children to school, even if it was just for the afternoon. But for myself, I feel it's about the preventative stuff. We need to get back to that. And sadly, all the money was then pulled. I get then pulled into area team. My caseload was massive and I couldn't do any of the preventative work anymore. And it's really frustrating, like what Liz was saying as well. We know these things and we see these things, and the promise is great in theory. And I've been on lots of the calls and seen a lot of the brilliant stuff, but some of this has been done before. It's not you. Going and doing projects in different areas is not you. It was there before, but they pulled it. So I just hope that the budget gets sorted. That's my thing, because it's generation after generation. You've got 2 or 3 generations now not know how to parent, because the granny's no longer the granny that you used to rely on. So that's my Tuppensworth. That just feels like the preventative stuff in the areas needs to get back in the actual communities with the people, walking alongside, not telling them how to do it, but advising and supporting them and building up their self-esteem.
Yeah, great point. George, you like to?
Yes, Ailey, you raise a very important point, which is also going to be part of the Transforming Scotland in a Generation report, which is the role of communities. And we're going to be recommending a very, very strong role for communities in doing something. And back in 2018, we actually got funding from the big lottery to set up a number of trauma-informed communities in Scotland. And I worked with one of those communities for over 2 years, even though the funding, rather like you said, after 6 months, the funding wasn't renewed. But that community was deeply committed to what we were doing together. And that community, by the way, was called Drumchapel. So I worked with Drumchapel. I love Drumchapel. Yeah. I worked with Drumchapel for 2 years. And the community enthusiasm, even with zero funding, to set in place the community supports for people, the preventive measures, and everyone was working together, the police, the health visitors, the local ministers, everyone was coming together with this enthusiasm. But after 2 years with zero funding, they just weren't able to continue, I'm sorry to say. And that's one of the problems we have to address. We have to have funding that isn't, here's 3 years to do something and then the money's taken away again, because that doesn't work. We have to have permanent funding. And again, that is one of the things that we intend to address in the Transforming Scotland report. But thank you. That community point is a very, very vital one. And congratulations to Drumchapel.
I'm going to finish there just at the very least so that we can feel a bit cooler when we get out of here. But you've all done well to cope with the heat. And thank you to George and Danny. You've both been very insightful, inspiring as well as very honest, and I'm really grateful for your responses and for all that you've said. I hope that you'll come back here on the 4th of September when we've got Karen McCluskey, who may be known to a number of you as the Chief Exec in Community Justice Scotland. She was the head of the Violence Reduction Unit. She's a very well-known figure in Scotland and a very engaging figure with a lot to say, particularly about prevention and acting early. So hope you'll come back to hear her. But can we just give a round of applause to Danny and George?